trustees of the Christian church at that time very nicely let the society use this building, which we have for 50 years, and in 1968 built the carriage house. And you'll be hearing more about these things and the history of the society as summer goes on. Also, in part, this lecture series is made possible by the Community Building Mini Grants Program of New Bedford's United Way. We qualified for a small grant to cover the costs of the DVDs. So, without further ado, I shall start talk one. Mattapoisett history starts, if you're going to give it a precise date, about 1680. But I like to go back a little bit and picture, kind of set the stage, and so we don't suddenly land like a man on Mars here in Mattapoisett. And so if you look back in the history of this area, back to 1602. In 1602, an Englishman by the name of Bartholomew Gosnold arrived in Buzzards Bay and anchored his ship Concord in the lee of Cuttyhunk Island at the head of our bay, May 31st, 1602. He was sailing for his English Queen Elizabeth, and the voyage was financed by the Earl of Somerset. At any rate, they had crossed the Atlantic, they had sighted land off of Nova Scotia and had come down the coast and around the Cape and wound up at the mouth of Buzzards Bay and Cuttyhunk. Originally they had planned to leave men for the winter, to winter in and come back the following summer, but instead they packed up and left within 3 weeks. However, while they were here, they reconnoitered our bay. The logs of Bartholomew Gosnold show that they explored the deep harbor across from Cuttyhunk on the mainland, and that would have been New Bedford Harbor. And I think it goes without saying they probably circled the whole bay. And what's interesting about Bartholomew Gosnold is he left his footprint for us here in this area, because he's the one that named the Elizabeth Islands after his Queen Elizabeth. He's also the one that named Martha's Vineyard. It was just Vineyard, and he named it Martha after his daughter Martha back in England, who had her 5th birthday, I believe, while he was over here. At any rate, he turned around within 3 or 4 weeks and went home to England. That was 1602. The next Englishman to visit our area was Henry Hudson in 1609. He was sailing for the Dutch, not the English, and of course he sailed up the Hudson River, that bears his name today. In 1614, another Dutch, he wasn't Dutch, a Dutch captain by the name of Adrian Block came and landed on Block Island, which carries his name to today. In 1620, we know what happened. In 1620, the Pilgrims aboard the Mayflower crossed the Atlantic. They were actually headed for Jamestown, but a few navigation errors, they didn't have their GPS turned on or something. They wound up off of Cape Cod, touched briefly at Provincetown, that's why the big Pilgrims Monument is out there, crossed Cape Cod Bay and landed on the shores of Plymouth, in Plymouth Harbor. 102 people, led by William Bradford and Miles Standish, And as we know, they founded the Plymouth Colony, 1620. And these were educated people. William Bradford spoke 7 languages. These were people that were being persecuted in England and were running for their, or looking for their religious freedom. The Atlantic to find it, as we'll see many others did as well. And we know the story of the Pilgrims. They had a very difficult winter, that first winter. Only 44 of that original 102 survived the winter, and they wouldn't have survived if the indigenous Native Americans, the Wampanoags, hadn't taken care of them and fed them, and in many cases nursed them back to health when spring came. And of course, the chief of the Wampanoags was Chief Mattapoisett. In 1624, 4 years later, the Dutch, following Hudson and Adrian Block, settled on Manhattan Island. And they pulled one of the greatest land deals ever pulled in the history of mankind when they bought all of Manhattan Island from the Indians for only $24, some 22,000 acres. And I don't want to tell stories about the Dutch, but the Dutch really weren't very good colonists, so to speak. They were not friendly with their Native American neighbors at all. As a matter of fact, there are some terrible stories about the atrocities that they pulled. And of course, the Iroquois, the Indians in that area, would attack them. And so they built a wall. The Dutch built a wall across the lower end of Manhattan to keep the Iroquois out. And of course, since it was a wall, it needed to be tended to, they had a road built along just inside the wall to tend to it. Well, you can see the rest of the story. History went on for another 400 years, but the wall went, but the street remained, and we have Wall Street today. That's why that is called Wall Street down in that area. But that's historic trivia that you might want to just tuck away. At any rate, 3 years later, in 1627, the Dutch sailed up into Buzzards Bay here to the head of the bay and up what we have today, the Cape Cod Canal, but at that time was the Monument River. And they established a trading post, the Mattapoisett trading post at the head of the bay, just up the Monument River. And if you go to Bourne today, to the Bourne Historical Society, they have reconstructed this trading post and actually reconstructed a salt works there as well. So it's nice to go and see it. But what was important was that they were striking out to trade with the Plymouth Colony, which had been established just 7 years earlier in 1620. And Miles Standish and others came and visited the Mattapoisett trading post a number of times. And if you look at, we will sometime as we go on with these lectures, the history of the Cape Cod Canal, Miles Standish was the first one to ever say, we ought to build a canal across here. And it's fairly easy because the Monument River went in from the head of Buzzards Bay, and Scusset Creek, a river, came in from Cape Cod Bay, and there was only about 3/4 of a mile in between the headwaters of each. And of course, that's the trail that the canal finally took when it was first built in 1904, and then the Army Engineers followed again when they took over in 1936. At any rate, to go on with our story and get to Mattapoisett, between 1630 and 1640 was the Great Puritan Migration, when many, many souls fled the Church of England and came across the Atlantic and settled on our shores. Some 75,000 to be exact fled England, and 15,000 of them settled here in Massachusetts, the majority of them north of the Cape, and they founded or formed the Bay Colony with Boston as its head. And their leader at the time was John Winthrop, who was a lawyer, a manor lord, but he'd had it up to here with the King of England and the Church of England, and off he took along with 75,000 others. And he was actually governor of the Bay Colony for 19 years. Well, you know, we humans are all the same. We ran across the Atlantic for our religious freedom, but once we got here and had it, we began to become less tolerant of others. And so it was only within a few years that different groups began to break off from this Bay Colony to go elsewhere for their freedom. And so in 1635, the Reverend Thomas Hooker left the Bay Colony and went to Hartford, Connecticut, or rather founded Hartford, Connecticut, on the Connecticut River and the Connecticut Colony. In 1636, a year later, Roger Williams did the same thing, but of course founded the colony in Rhode Island. And then more importantly to us, in 1650 or 1652, another group broke off from the Bay Colony and came down and settled in the Dartmouth area. That whole area from where we think of New Bedford Harbor all the way to Westport, that whole tract of land was referred to as Dartmouth. They were Quakers and Baptists, and they pulled a pretty good land deal too. They signed the Dartmouth Compact with Chief Mattapoisett of the Wampanoags, and supposedly for a stack of blankets, they got all that Dartmouth land. It's known as the Dartmouth Compact. And that was Joseph Russell and Benjamin Tabor were the two men that led the settlement there in Dartmouth. And at the same time, people split off from the Bay Colony as well as the Plymouth Colony and went down the Cape and settled down the Cape to Provincetown and out to Nantucket. All right, now the reason I labor all of this is that these people spread out and they settled all around this area. This area, a tract of land that went from East Fairhaven, so to speak, or if you want, New Bedford Harbor, but East Fairhaven, all the way to the Weebiantic River, the head of Buzzards Bay, Wareham, and bordered on the south, of course, by our Buzzards Bay, and then stretched northward all the way up to Middleborough, Taunton. That whole tract of land was left to the Indians, to the Wampanoags. That's where they lived. And the white settlers seemed to be content to settle in the areas that I have outlined and further inland. And they left this tract of land, which was referred to as the lands of Sippacan, to the Wampanoags. And down on the shore of this tract of land that was referred to as the lands of Sippacan, the old maps show like a little strip that runs along our shoreline over towards West Island, and on it is written the Plantation of Mattapoisett. And it is spelled M-A-T-A-P-O-Y-S-T. And that is, of course, where we are. And the Plantation of Mattapoisett was the Wampanoag name for this area, as we know. We've had the translation of Mattapoisett many times as place of rest. And the Wampanoags that lived in this area, they had a cycle, a rhythm of their life. Whether they lived over on the shores of Wareham and the Weiranic River, or in Marion or Sippacan and the Sippacan River, but principally here in Mattapoisett with the Mattapoisett River, because it was a major water flow. And the Wampanoags would summer down on the water's edge, and they would plant corn, and they would live on fish and on sea fish, shellfish, around the mouth of the river. As a matter of fact, that was their colony there at the mouth of the Mattapoisett River. And they paddled their birch bark canoes. I'm sure they went out to the islands and all around. In the wintertime, however, they left the seashore and went inland up to what we would call Lakeville today, up to the ponds. Large long pond up there and the Quiticus ponds, and there they wintered in with their tents and their huts, and they lived on the white-tailed deer and the rabbits, and they fished through the ice. And so this was the cycle, to the summer down to the shoreline, to the winter back up to the lakes. And probably this was a cycle that had gone on for 1,000 years, maybe longer. Unfortunately, it all came to an abrupt halt when good old Chief Mattapoisett of the Wampanoags died in 1675, and his older son, King Philip, as he liked to be called, took over the head of the Wampanoags and vowed to rid the soil of the white man. It's too bad he was the older son, because the youngest son was Wampanoag, and he was friendly to the white man the same as his father had been, but that wasn't the case. And so what followed for the next 5 years, from 1675 to 1680, was a very bloody, bloody war, a period of 5 years known as King Philip's War. And we're not going to fight that here tonight. There have been several books written in the last 5 or 10 years about this very bloody war, full of atrocities on both sides. But finally, in 1680, it was over. The Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony and the Rhode Island Colony and 2 colonies in Connecticut bound together, and with this coalition known as the Confederation, the New England Confederation, overcame King Philip and his warriors, and the area finally settled down, but without, unfortunately, the Wampanoags. All right, so what did that mean for this area? It meant for the first time, this area now was open to settlement. It was open to investors who bought the land from the Great General Court of Plymouth. If you want to say who owned the land, well, once the Indians were gone, the Wampanoags were gone, it belonged to the Plymouth Colony, the Great General Court of Plymouth. And so the land was sold to investors. And so the first settlers that came into this land were then about 1680, following this very bloody war, the King Philip War. And they came in, of course, over the old Indian trails. And they were looking for land to live on, for farms. And it was beautiful land. As I mentioned before, the Indians had cleared much of the shore where they had planted their corn. In the summertime, they were referred to as the grassy plains in colonial records. The marshes were thick with salt hay, which would be good for the barnyards. The Mattapoisett River, as well as the other riverbeds, Sippacan and Wewianick, had rich bottomland on each side that would be good for crops and good for pastures. And so the land of Sippacan, in a sense, welcomed these early settlers. Now, there had been 32 investors that had bought parcels of land. They came from Plymouth, Barnstable, and from Boston. And most of them bought the land as an investment rather than coming to settle. However, a number of them did, as we know. And there were a group that settled in Wareham, in Sippacan, Rochester, and then a group that came here. And we know the names of the people that came here, the first group that came. There were the Hammonds, two brothers, John and Samuel. And actually John had 4 sons, and they came and they settled on the west side of the Mattapoisett River and went down the Mattapoisett Neck all the way to Brand Island. Moses Barlow and his family settled up, not here on the waterfront, but up on what's now Park Street. They wanted to be inland, and of course that is high land. They probably picked that ridge up there for their farm. The Dexters there were 4 sons there as well. The Dexters went down to Pine Island and settled and built their homes around Pine Island Cove. And the reason that, of course, that's called Pine Island down there is that the 2 points, Strawberry and Angelica, used to be densely forested with white pine. And so they were Pine Islands. And so you had Pine Island and Pine Island Pond, Pine Island Road, etc., etc. At any rate, they came and they settled. Trees were felled. Logs were trimmed and notched, and walls were built, and ridge poles were put in place, and roofs were put up and shingled, and stumps were pulled out of the ground from where the trees had been cut for the cabins. Stones were dragged out of the ground, moved out of the way, and piled along the edges of the clearings, or stone walls, and the ground, the rough, coarse ground, sowed with seed. Barns were raised, fences built, livestock purchased and put out to pasture. Everything had to be made, of course, tables, chairs, beds, and so on. So it was a very busy time. Old records tell of sawmills and grist mills along the Mattapoisett River, Wewianick River, forges, iron forges, mills, forges up around the ponds up in Rochester, of timberland and salt marsh being surveyed and sold. Since this land had been bought by investors, why, if they had a chance to sell it for more money, they would sell it. Some of the investors that lived in Barnstable, Plymouth, never even saw the land. They bought it purely on speculation. The records also tell of the first religious ceremonies in this area, the Sunday services over at Minister's Rock. And Minister's Rock is in Marion, in Sippacan. It's at the corner, roughly, of Hermitage Road, which goes off Route 6 on Little Neck there, Hermitage Road and Oakdale. There's a big split boulder there that's like a ledge that sticks up, and like a pulpit up above, and the congregation would stand out in front, and he would stand up on top of this boulder, Minister's Rock, and preach his sermon. And it was the religious center for the whole area. They came from Rochester and from Mattapoisett and Wareham, 2 services here on a Sunday morning. And you may have, should go over and look at that rock. It's got a plaque on it now, and I know it well because my mother grew up almost across the street from it. She used to tell me she used to go over and play dolls in the shadow, in the shade, on a Sunday afternoon. At any rate, in 1685, they actually built a small church right there, and for the settlers from the surrounding areas to come to. And also, it was about this time in 1686 that Rochester was named, town of Rochester, which included the villages of Mattapoisett, Sippacan, and at that time Wareham as well. And the reason it was named Rochester is that many of the settlers here were grandchildren of the great Puritan migration that had come across the Atlantic, and many of those people had come from the county of Kent, England, which has a shoreline, southern coast of England, and one of the little villages on that shoreline was named Rochester. And Rochester, England was known for its very tasty, juicy oysters. And Buzzards Bay has tasty, juicy oysters. And so when these people had their cookout, so to speak, and ate these oysters, it reminded them of their grandparents and of Rochester, England, and so they petitioned the Great and General Court of Plymouth to name this land of Sippacan Rochester. And so the township of Rochester came into being in 1686, and as we know, we still have our Rochester minus Wareham, Sippacan, and Mattapoisett. But that's a much later story that we want to get into. All right, so we've got our people now. They have settled, and that's the first phase of our story. The second phase of our story, again, is that they came to build farms, but they also came for another reason. They came to get into trade, trading. You know, if you want to make money, and these people were investors, if you want to make money, you have to have something to sell, right? And we had a forest, 70 square miles, loaded with products of the forest. And so if you could get those, that timber, whether it was in the form of cordwood or planks or fence posts or fence railings or shingles or whatever it may be, down an onboard ship, then you could take it and sell it or trade it. And where would they trade it? Well, they could trade it to these areas that had been building up around the lands of Sippacan when they had been the Wampanoag's home for 50 years. And so you had merchants living in Newport and on Nantucket and in Boston who were hungry for this type of material and would pay for it. And so these men that came, their first goal was to establish themselves with their farms so they could be self-sufficient. But secondly, to cash in on their investment and start selling and trading. And of course, trade was the backbone of the entire east coast of the United States. And of course, all that trading was done in thousands of little vessels that were the mainstay of the economic cycle, because it wasn't until the advent of the railroad in the early and mid-1800s to get away from the water. The water was the only way to transport anything of any bulk at all. And so that's what these men, the next step that they went into by the 1690s, because it was trade. It would be trade that turned farmers into shipwrights, that trade that turned farmers into sailors, and sailors into captains, and captains into merchants. It would be trade that took youngsters and roughened them into sailors, to sail the ships. Trade built schools and churches. It turned log cabins into farmhouses, and farmhouses into dignified houses along shaded village streets, as we have. Of course, we used to have a lot more shade when we had our big elms, but that was a while ago. So trade it was. And as I mentioned a minute ago, there was plenty to trade. The swamps were full of cedar, red cedar, which was good for shingles, for houses, whether they be in Nantucket or in Westport or Boston. There were oaks that were centuries old that were good for house timbers and ship timbers. There were white pines galore for planking. We have white pine boards here on the floor of this building. There was pitch pine for turpentine. There was maple and white birch for charcoal. There was black walnut for furniture, and trees and trees and trees for cordwood and fence railings and fence posts. And so these were the items that were loaded onto small vessels and sent out across the bay to market, so to speak. But to do that, of course, you had to build docks and wharves and whatnot. So here in Mattapoisett, they didn't build here on our harbor front where we are today and take for granted. They built down on the salt pond at the head of the river, of the Mattapoisett River. And the reason for that, of course, is that it offered them so much more protection, particularly from the southeast, as we know. Get out of that bad roll and chop that comes in off the bay. And if you mentally take the railroad bed, which was built in the 1850s, the railroad bed that cuts across that salt pond out of there, you really have a large pond there. And back in those days, you didn't have to get all kinds of permits to take your oxen and your drag line, so to speak, and clear that mud out of there and get it deep enough at high tide to float your vessels. And along the shores, particularly on the west bank, they built their docks. The oxen dragged down huge logs that were sharpened and pulled upright with an A-frame, driven down into the soft river bottom, and then side logs placed in, and the whole business filled up with rock and gravel, and then a layer of timber put across the top. And you had your first wharves that your vessels could come up to. We won't call them ships yet, but mainly beamy sloops could come up and load up and be on their way. Now, I made it sound very easy. They loaded up and put to sea and sold their goods. Well, they did. But there were others out there that wanted to take their money, and they were called pirates. We had pirates back in those days, in the 1690s, that last decade there, 1690 to 1700. And two such pirates were Thomas Pound and who was my other guy here? well, let's just stick with Thomas Pound. The pirates would shelter in Tarpaulin Cove, and from Tarpaulin Cove, of course, they could see Vineyard Sound and out to the mouth of the sound, and then, of course, they would come and duck around through Quix's Hole into the bay, and they could see any vessels sailing up and down the bay. And we were all citizens of the Crown of England, of course, and when the pirates actually shut down the trade, and so the merchants in Boston and Newport and Nantucket petitioned the Crown to do something about these pirates, because they wanted the goods that were coming from this area. And so eventually Her Majesty's armed sloop, the Mary, was dispatched from Boston under the command of Samuel Pease, and it sailed around the Cape and arrived at Tarpaulin Cove on October 4th, 1691. Thomas Hawkins was the other pirate. He fired a shot across the bow of the pirate vessel. The pirates answered with a volley of musket fire. Captain Pease of Her Majesty's ship, the Mary, was wounded, but the Marines aboard the Mary fired several volleys, and both pirate vessels succumbed. Unfortunately, Captain Pease died of his wounds the next day in Newport, but the pirates were marched to Boston, where they were condemned and hanged. And so trade again resumed. But that was only one of the problems that they were facing. The other problem was that there was a series of small wars going on in Europe all through this period. And the phrase was, when Europe sneezed, the world had a cold. And the reason for that statement is that the European nations were colonial powers and had colonies all over the world. So when England and France primarily fought each other over there, their colonies in the New World fought each other. And of course the French were in Canada and we were here. And what those French did was to excite the Indians to attack the English, us, the colonists here. And so this is exactly what happened. It was known as the War of the League of Augsburg over there in England and Europe, which we don't really care about that name. What we care about is King William's War, because King William was on the throne of England at the time. It was known as King William's War here in the colonies. And what that meant to us, even here in Mattapoisett, was that we had to answer the call of the Crown and go and fight, which we did. A number of colonists, men of course, had to leave their farms and leave their sloops tied up down in the salt pond and go off to Canada. As a matter of fact, we have an entry that Captain Church in 1691 sailed his sloop with men up the coast of Maine to Canada. At any rate, the French were defeated in Europe and in the colonies here. But there was a great deal of hard feeling now between the French in Canada and the English here, as well as in Europe, between the English crown and the French crown. And so suddenly, along with pirates, we had French privateers, French ships, preying on our sloops and schooners, carrying their cargoes from here to Nantucket and Newport, and even New York. 1662, I believe, the British kicked the Dutch out, and New Amsterdam became New York. And a little side note, another little bit of trivia for your historic interest here. In 1696, a French privateer was sailing up and down the bay, waiting for some sloop loaded with cargo to poke her nose out beyond the necks, or a vessel to come in with a fat purse from selling their produce, and got herself trapped down at the head of the bay in the shoal water, and the local militia down in the Wareham area went out and overcame the French crew of the privateer and marched the crew up to Boston, the Frenchmen. And when they marched to Plymouth, where they spent the night, there was some kind of epidemic going on. And the privateer evidently was a good-sized ship, and so it had a surgeon on board, a doctor. And the doctor's name was Dr. LeBaron. And since there was some kind of epidemic going on in Plymouth, the town fathers of Plymouth prevailed upon the militia captain to leave Dr. LeBaron there in Plymouth to tend the sick, while the rest in the next morning were marched off to Boston, either to be locked up or hanged, one or the other. But what's interesting is that 75 years later, this Dr. LeBaron's grandson was one of the early reverends here in Mattapoisett, the Reverend Lemuel LeBaron. And of course, the name LeBaron has stayed in Mattapoisett, as we know, for years and years and years. By the 1690s or late 1690s, Hammond Town emerged as the center of this area. The Dexter brothers gave it a good run down there, but they didn't have the water power in Pine Island Pond that they had at Mattapoisett River, where they could run their water wheels. You know, you just had to have moving water. You didn't have to have great waterfalls. You just built your water wheel up, and all you had to do, once you had a wheel that would move as the current flowed under it and turned an axle, you could do all kinds of things with gears. Wooden gears they were. You could run your grist mill and your stones around to grind your corn. You could saw your lumber, not with a circular saw, with an up and down saw, because you just put a big wheel on the end of that axle and a bolt out at the side and put a piston on it, so to speak, and as that wheel went around, it goes up and down, and you hooked it to your saw, and you didn't have to pull the saw up and down, the water moved the saw. So they had the edge. The Hammonds had the edge, and they very quickly built up a sizable population there. Also, many of the Barlows moved into that area as well. A bridge was built across the Mattapoisett River at approximately the same place that the Arch Bridge is today. It was built by building, as I said, the wharves that we built down on the edge of the river a minute ago. They built one on each side of the river at that point, and then had oxen drag along logs across, which they decked over, and that was a bridge. And then from that bridge, we have a record that says that Aaron Barlow and Lieutenant John Hammond laid out a town highway, a road through the woods to Rochester, which would have been more or less River Road, Crystal Spring Road, and on up the Rochester Road on North Street up to the center of Rochester. And for many years, there was no road from Crystal Spring down to Route 6 that we're by the water tower that we're so familiar with today. That was built at a much later time. Lieutenant John Hammond was the head of Hammond Town, so to speak. He was a selectman. He was a lieutenant in the Her Majesty's militia, and he built his house at the well, actually today would be it's where the Chowder House is, where the Chowder House at the junction of Route 6 and River Road there. A big square, two-story, center chimney house. And that was the main byway, not Route 6, but from the neck up to Rochester on the highway that we just built. And up and down that highway or road came all the goods that were brought down, the planks and the boards that were going to be loaded onto the sloops for trade, and then the loads of salt hay and what went back up into Rochester by the doors of this house. The house also served as a school. They used the way that schools worked in those days was that in Sippacan, Wareham, Rochester, and Mattapoisett, the teacher, there'd be one teacher for the whole area, and he would come to each place for 3 months. And so somebody gave up a room for those 3 months to have the local children come and be instructed. And so the Hammond House served that purpose as well. Also, one of the rooms was a tavern where the gossip and the news of the day was exchanged. Now we get to the third point of Mattapoisett. There are 4 key things, building blocks of Mattapoisett. Farms, we've talked about now. Trade, we've talked about. And the third one, which we'll end with, is shipbuilding. Because as the trade developed more and more, they needed more and more vessels, small vessels, plus they lost so many vessels to the pirates and to the privateers and uncharted waters and storms. And originally they had purchased vessels from Newport and Taunton, but you know, it made more sense to begin to build their own. So right there down on the salt pond, they began to, that's where the first vessels in Mattapoisett were built. And again, the oxen dragged the logs down. They were shaped with the adze for the keel and the stem, and the stern posts were hewn out, and the ribs were put in, and the white pine planking was sawed with an up and down saw, and the vessel was shaped with the ribbons of pine connecting and fastened to all of the ribs, and of course in those days all with pegs, and then they were caulked with the oakum, with cotton or whatever they could find probably to make the vessel watertight. The local blacksmith would make all of the iron work that was necessary, rudder, gudgeons, the pieces of iron for the stays and the shackles and such things that was necessary for a vessel. And this was all done with what was called the right of eye. I mean, these men were not professional shipbuilders. They were farmers, and ship and sailors, but they had the feel for it, and so they built these clumsy vessels that could hardly claw to windward, but they could carry a cargo. And our professional shipbuilders don't come until we get to the mid-1750s. And when we get to the 1750s, the professional shipbuilders come down from South Shore Boston, from Marshfield and Hanover and Scituate. And they're the ones that begin to put Mattapoisett on the map as a shipbuilding harbor. But these first ships built here in the late 1690s and early 1700s were not those vessels. And so shipbuilding is our third cornerstone. One of the early ships belonged to Captain Ben Hammond, Lieutenant John Hammond's brother, and Captain Benjamin Hammond was a sea captain, whereas Lieutenant John was in the militia. And Captain Ben sailed the Dolphin was the name of his vessel. And I just give you a few numbers here to show you the size of the vessels we're talking about. They loaded 7 cords of wood onto the deck of one of these vessels. You know, a cord is 4 by 4 by 8 feet, 120 fence rails, 60 posts. Another cargo was 63 barrels of charcoal. You know, we don't think much about charcoal today, but they used to use charcoal even to pave roads because it packed down so tightly. And of course, to make charcoal, you had to cut cords and cords of maple and birch, and you actually baked it in a huge earthen oven, where you build a fire and then cover it, and it smoldered in there, and it all turned to charcoal, the same charcoal that you buy today in a bag at Shaw's or Stop and Shop. But that charcoal was a desired commodity because it packed down tightly. At any rate, 63 barrels of charcoal, 6,000 bundles of shingles. I mean, they were really a trading concern. And one last thought here before we stop, and that is, as these sloops now began to trade further and further afield with their cargoes, so to speak, they were going down the coast, all the way down to the Carolinas and into Virginia, the Virginia Capes, and even further down to the West Indies or the Caribbean. And they would return with cargoes of barrels of sugar, molasses, rum, tobacco, things that people up here couldn't go down to the corner store and buy. And so this became a very desirable trade up and down the coast. But it brought back to this area a vision of a totally different way of life. The young men, farm boys, shipped on board Dad's vessel, Uncle Ed's vessel, and went down. When they came back and they sat around Lieutenant John's tavern at night with the fire crackling in the hearth, sipping their rum, they talked about life down there in the tropics, about palm-ringed harbors of white sand and white houses, and how there were courtly men and graceful ladies sitting on the porches and verandas while hundreds of slaves worked out in the fields. totally different from what was going on up here in workaday New England, dressed in your homespun. And so those stories began to circulate back, and more young men began to get into this trade and go to sea as young men. And we're going to stop there for tonight, but next episode will be the fourth cornerstone of Mattapoisett, which is going to be whaling, greasy voyages, which leads us both into the building of whale ships as well as whalers sailing out of Mattapoisett, and then the Revolutionary War. Anyway, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll have another session next month. Just watch The Wanderer, and you'll know when. Thank you.